So we cut out in the beginning of the year amicably.
Yeah.
In part because we're about to open a store. So
Right,
we're going
right.
to now be able to take advantage of this.
Right.
And the weird poetic justice of it is we're now going to earn back, if we do it right, in 3 years, what we've lost trying to distribute our own books through this distributor in six
That's amazing.
over 6
And
years.
you don't have to do the travel because the people are coming to you.
Yes. And what's really sad, and, without, putting too big of a microscope on it, is most of the independent bookstores that are left, certainly the ones in Los Angeles, are all operating at a loss, and it's some wealthy person that's funding it as almost a passion project, which is great.
Or a write-off, yeah.
It's great that they're willing to do it, but something is inherently wrong where the store's getting 4 times what the publisher gets who
Right.
actually makes the book.
Right.
They can't really pay their employees that great, and yet they're somehow also not making money.
Well, let's not forget the author who wrote
Yes.
the book.
Well, and that's the thing. The authors and the publishers have now been put in a situation, like most musicians now, where you're basically out there promoting yourself with no money ever going back to you in the form of royalties. There's been a handful of books where we've been able to pay out a little bit in royalties, but it's almost non-existent. I mean, and we're not even getting salaries or like healthcare.
Yeah.
Everyone's kind of paid per project, and that's the only way that it can live. It's tough to attract investment for something like this too, because unless someone is really rooted in loving, say, books or records and has that nostalgia for the physical object, it's hard to justify to
They're going to say it's
investors.
not financially viable.
Yeah. And they're going to say, and so we, I should say, full disclosure, during COVID, one of the things that saved Hat and Beard was we started a nonprofit called Invisible Republic, which is named after Greil Marcus's famous book about Bob Dylan's basement tapes, which
Right.
has since come out since the book became famous under the title he originally wanted, which is a more apt title, The Old Weird America, The World of Bob Dylan's Basement Tapes. Invisible Republic is a very inexplicable name, but I loved the metaphor that Greil Marcus was using to describe what Dylan's mindset was after the motorcycle accident, where he basically retreats to this house in Woodstock
Right.
and only lets like 10 people in. The band, Allen Ginsberg, a handful of other people, and he's in the basement going back to
Yeah.
his sort of roots after becoming this kind of not quasi-celebrity, like the voice of a generation type of person. That
A lot of people know this now because of the movie, too.
because of the movie, yeah. And he was sort of reluctant to be that person. And so then, in a way, I think it saved his creative mojo. I mean, not that there weren't some doozy records over the last 5-6 decades, but, if you look at like a Bob Dylan or a Neil Young or, the late Lou Reed, they were still kind of pushing the envelope and doing interesting stuff.
Or Nick Cave, we were just talking about.
Yes.
Yeah.
Nick Cave is, some people are fanatics of the Birthday Party and the sort of 90s records, and I totally get that, but I still think, they're making incredible records now, and they're not sort of on that circuit where they're just kind of playing the hits. And I'm not ripping on all those bands that just kind of do the country fairs and the arena rock stuff where they just play the hits. I get that too in this particular environment. You got to do whatever you got to do to make a living.
Well, let's look at Prince, too, before he passed away, railing against the system and standing up for the rights of artists, whether
Yes.
they're musicians,
Yeah, the
writers.
artist formerly known as Prince, where he went as a symbol at a certain point to go around the copyright law.
To get out of his Warner Brothers.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's great examples like Metal Machine Music, which of course Lee Reed later on tried to spin off as some sort of classical.
Or the Neil Young, the trans.
Yeah, trans, yeah. Which I love, by the way. The first book that...
you know what I mean, though. It's not one that you're going to hear on the radio.
Totally. The first book that we published, it was under... Stop Smiling had a brief, book imprint before I went to work for the bigger publishers. I'm hoping to reissue it through Hat and Beard. We've since reissued the other book we published under the Stop Smiling imprint, but the first book we did was called How to Recognize Speech. The history of the vocoder from World War II to hip-hop. The Machine Speaks.
That sounds awesome.
And there's a whole chapter on trans because it is one of those kind of rock records where he uses the vocoder.
Yeah.
And there's a really...
To an extreme.
Yeah, to an extreme. I mean, of course, there's this charming story of his kid has...
Yeah, that's what I said, beautiful
a special
concept.
need. I can't remember, is it cystic fibrosis? I can't remember what his kid
he's trying to communicate with his son, which is beautiful.
Yeah.
But to the general public, it was hard to understand.
His fuck you to Geffen was... Well, it doesn't say I can't change genres. So that's why in the early 80s, there's trance, there's like a rockabilly record, there's the, what is it, On the Beach record. I mean, where he just completely goes in a 180 from whatever Neil Young is sort of used. And that was sort of the contractual obligation to get out of the deal he was in.
One of my favorite bands is Bauhaus. And one of the best books I bought in the last few years is Kevin Haskins, the drummer, put out this great, huge coffee table book called Bauhaus Undead, The Visual History and Legacy of Bauhaus. This is amazing because not only does he have photos and tell the story of the band, but he has like receipts for things like when they bought the hearse that they would drive around in. But anyway, Cleopatra Records put the book out. So do you find any correlations by record companies that are putting out books about the bands and you guys who have put out quite, what do you have, 75 books, and a lot of them are about musicians, right?
Exactly. I think part of it is my music background, and had I not had that, I was always publishing zines with my friends, but my friends who stayed in the music business are now running the show if they stayed in that world. And COVID really kind of accelerated this too, because bands couldn't tour. So then it was this idea of, well, can we create something else for the fans?
Let's tell our story because we're stuck at home. And
so we started to do more of that. And then, I think at the end of the day, my favorite part of making books is the archival part of it, in like the art of discovery, where you're going through one band's archive. Mark Webber and I have become close friends, and he plays in a band called Pulp.
Yeah.
And during COVID, we were on a Zoom one day, and I was like, hey, man, what's all that shit behind you? And there were just all these archival boxes of stuff. And he was like, oh, that's the Pulp archive. And I said, and I knew he had played in the band. He, at that point, was working as a film programmer.
Right.
Because they had broken up in 2002. And I was like, well, what's the Pulp archive? And he sent me like an iPhone photo of maybe 500 random things that were in this archive. And I was like, holy shit. Now, he has an interesting story in that he grew up in Sheffield like the band did, and was the fan club president of both them and I think Spaceman 3.
Oh, I forgot about that.
And then became the tour manager, and then joined the band right before Different Class, which was their breakthrough record. And I think a lot of people don't realize that Pulp formed in 1978.
I didn't know that.
So like around the time of
I didn't
Bauhaus,
hear about them until the 90s.
Gristles. See, because they didn't break till the 90s. There was sort of these wilderness years, and of course, Jarvis goes to school at St. Martin's Art College and majors in film. Anyways, Mark had kept this archive, and that book, which came out last fall, and just happened to time beautifully with them getting back together and touring.
Yeah.
And then they've just put out this new record, which is the number one record now in the UK. That book was almost like the gold standard for bands of a certain era that were playing music in a pre-digital age, where there was the receipts, the handbills, the flyers, the record label promotional merchandise that would be made, that was physical stuff that would be taken into the stores and given to the rep. The reps for the record labels would go in and
they do the flats. I remember because I worked in record stores too.
Yeah, and like all that stuff would never happen now because we're in this digital age. And so I've almost found, our niche in a way. As we come out of this kind of second downturn, I should back up and say Trump getting back in and the wildfires here basically derailed 4 years of us rebuilding the company from scratch, having almost gone out of business when everything shut down. And I think one of my biggest mistakes was not realizing how vital the experiential part of what we do was.
Right.
So suddenly you have this 100-year plague and no one can go out for 2 years. Without the art book fairs, without all the events, it just doesn't work.
Yeah.
There's not a way to connect in person with the audience to sell enough of the product without all the cuts going to the wholesaler and the retailer.
And to have that experience we were just talking about.
Yes. And so the nonprofit sort of gave us a runway to be able to fund some of the art monographs and the smaller run stuff, and not even try to make money with that, just try to break even.
Right.
But what is kind of great is that these books that we're making about one singular film or one band is probably what's going to sustain what we're doing, because we can then tap into that already existing audience and market them this book that collects part of that story.
Yeah.
I mean, the other thing we've been doing too is just like, my friend, you mentioned this earlier before we started recording, just made this great film about Genesis P-Orridge, which gets into the history of Throbbing Gristle and Psychic TV, which is sort of the beginning of industrial music.
An acid house.
Yeah, an acid house. And so you get, and I wasn't, I did grow up in Chicago, and I saw Ministry and Revolting Cocks and all that stuff. The second wave of that in the 80s and 90s was huge. It really wasn't my world. I was more in the sort of Jesus Lizard, shellac.
They just played here,
Palace Brothers. Yeah.
Jesus Lizard. They were
I mean, it's like, because, I worked at Touch and Go and, Drag City, and that kind of music was my, sort of more my ilk. But, my friend made this film, and after seeing a rough cut and seeing all the musical stuff, I was like, wow, like I kind of forgot that Genesis was this kind of pioneer.
Huge
in this genre, because it wasn't really my genre. Ironically, the only musician who's talking in the film is David James from Bauhaus, who lives here. Who's around the same time.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, David J. Sorry. So, we made this little chapbook that's just taking the last interview with Genesis that's in the film, that's cut up, and it's not that long, but David, maybe interviewed Jen a week before she died.
Wow.
And it's only maybe 10 or 12,000 words, but it's really interesting because this interview is used as the basis for the entire documentary film, but then it becomes this little chapbook companion to the film. And when the film's out screening, all the Genesis heads come out, whether they're Psyche TV fans and are fans of the Acid House stuff, or, they're the goth industrial people or whatever. So there's this kind of built-in audience, and we saw it like after every screening, we'll sell 30 or 40 copies of the book. That's, the rule of thumb. And I guess this is probably the same with vinyl nowadays for those who are making it themselves, is it's not how many you sell anymore. It's how much you get paid for the ones that you do sell. And
that's a big proponent of what your company does.
Yeah. I mean, it's like we could sell 40 Genesis P-Orridge books. We'd have to sell 150 in the stores to make the same amount of money.
Right.
And so that differential to most people is nuts. And of course, Amazon and this distributor have done a really good job at bamboozling the public, so they have no idea what's really going on. People come up to me all the time and say, oh, I bought your Pulp book at Skylight Books in Los Feliz. And I'm always like, that's awesome. But unless Skylight bought those books directly from us and not from the wholesaler, we probably lost money on that sale.
Right.
And of course it's not their job to know how this stuff works. But I think despite the internet being this great tool to inform people, it's actually made it very hard to get through the morass of what is out there to know the truth about how to actually support creative people, whether they're musicians or authors or independent filmmakers. I mean, I can't even get into the film business. I almost gave up. I worked on a couple documentaries, and there were several more that looked like they had major legs, but the amount of talentless gatekeepers and sort of like sociopathic, media mogul type of people that are basically the arbiters of what gets done are so powerful that you almost like throw in the towel, and you see how basically the film business is now just a playground for people who are already wealthy, and they can afford to not work for 10 years to develop whatever IP they're working on.
And that's a very small part of the population.
Totally.
When I grew up in Rochester, I used to work at this place called the Little Theater, and it was amazing. It was all independent films all the time. I mean, that's where I saw Stop Making Sense, Home of the Brave. I mean, I knew about Helena Bonham Carter before she was with Tim Burton. She was very normal doing the movies with Daniel Day-Lewis.
Yes.
Room with a View.
Room with a View.
Are you finding, I was just a music teacher for 12 years, and I'm discovering a lot of the young people are not only getting into records and bands that actually played before Autotune and Beat Detective, but they're rediscovering these bands that you and I liked. Are you finding as younger people discover bands that we grew up with, that they're coming to you and wanting to get the books about Pulp or Lou Reed or stuff like that? Is it mostly people our age, or are you starting to see younger people discover these books?
That's a great question. I think it's both, but it's interesting. They're bought in two different ways. The super fans who are our age, Gen X and up, are buying it because of the nostalgia factor of them remembering 90s Britpop and saying, I want this Pulp book. They maybe got the new record too, so they sort of correlate that.
Yeah.
Where we're hitting the young people is at these book fairs and at the events themselves. So like last year when Pulp, they're doing a bigger tour this summer or this fall. They've been touring all summer. We actually just rushed out a paperback edition that's $32 and the hardcover was $50.
Yeah.
So some of this is generational and it's about disposable income. But to answer your question, that's what's so great about these book fairs. It's primarily Gen Z and millennials coming through.
Really?
And it's proof that this idea that they don't care about records or books is bullshit. Now, is it going to be what it was when we were growing up, when these were the mainstream formats and there was no other alternative?
Yeah.
No. But when
it's different, but it's good.
When 10,000 kids come through these fairs over like the course of a few days, they come with money to buy stuff and they're looking for things that are analog. And that's kind of remarkable. So we found that most of the Lou Reed and Velvet Underground books were sold directly to the millennials and Gen Z people. The older fans have more disposable income because they've worked longer. And they maybe already own all the Velvets records. So they're like, oh, cool, this is the only art book that's in print that's about the Velvets. So I got to get it. But it's almost crazy how it's really like two completely different silos.
Some of my students are asking me about John Spencer Blues Explosion or the Jesus Lizard. And I'm like, really? How do you know about that? And so for you to have these guys come check out the book, that must be amazing.
It's so great. I think, and I hope that it's not going to be all Britpop bands, but since the Pulp book came out, a number of bands have reached out to me, their management have reached out to me and said, you know, we have a cache of all of this stuff also that was saved by, you know, the guitarist or something. Someone in the band held on to everything.
Right. There's always one.
And we'd like to make a book too. You know, last summer I grew up in Chicago and I'm really good friends with the band Wilco. And they're kind of like the Grateful Dead of indie rock. Right. You know, and so you know, to put them against other bands is kind of tough because they can go out and they're kind of a super group, you know.
They're an anomaly.
Yeah, like, I mean, Pat Sampson is like an amazing multi-instrumentalist who, you know, everyone in the band kind of has, you know, Jeff and John Sterrett are from Uncle Tupelo, you know, but everybody else, you know, kind of joined the band at a certain point. And, you know, they've had the same kind of mega lineup for maybe about 20 some years now. But they do a music festival at Mass Mocha in Western Massachusetts, not far from Rochester, actually.
Yeah.
And it's called the Salad Sound Festival. And last summer, we went out there and did a pop-up during the festival.
Yeah.
And it was interesting because you saw, like, Wilco have a merch booth where, like, everyone in the band is in other bands and side projects.
And they got all their stuff there.
And, like, Jeff has, like, 4 books out. So you get to the merch booth and you're like, the merch booths of the future aren't just CDs and LPs. It's all the other accoutrements as well. Jeff has maybe 3 or 4 books out.
He's got that one about songwriting that almost everybody I know owns.
Yes. If you want to learn how to be a songwriter, Jeff's one of the greatest of his generation. You buy Jeff's book. You know, Pat happens to be an amazing photographer, so he's doing these photography books.
Yeah.
I remember looking at the merch table and it was sort of like an aha moment where the book just becomes this other thing that the bands now sell on tour. And because there's no money in streaming and most of touring, unless it's at a certain level, is also very profitless, this is probably the last bastion of money that can be made. Yeah. Is selling whatever merch they have. And so I've kind of doubled down on making more of these band books. I mean, also, for me, it's just so fun to be able to, you know, like Pulp were one of my favorite bands when I was in my late teens. I mean, Different Class was a record that changed my life in the sense that I have pretty, you know, my wife is a working class background. I have sort of a lower middle class background. That record, Different Class, that sort of was a complete skewering and satirical record about the class system in Britain, was like a complete revelation to me. Whereas I didn't really connect with Blur or Oasis. I didn't dislike their music. Yeah. But there was something about Pulp that spoke to me. And also Suede, who, you know, were kind of like a very Bowie-inspired, androgynous, you know, kind of gothy, kind of dark, broody, kind of hard rock band. It's interesting to see now. Obviously, Oasis and Blur were huge at the time and are now having this resurgence.
Yep.
The Oasis tour that everyone's been waiting for forever. But it's amazing to see Pulp is now bigger now, at least in the States, than they were in the 90s when they had like #1 records.
And I think a lot of these bands are actually, because I'm a musician, they're playing better. I don't know if it's because they're not on drugs anymore or they're wiser, or they're healthier. A lot of these bands I go see from the 90s are way better than when they were younger.
Absolutely. Pulp's sound now, because there's like 8 or 9 people in the band, it's just fuller, and they can recreate what's on those records in a way that they couldn't when they were just a 5-piece. Obviously, it's more expensive to have all those musicians on tour, but I completely agree. I mean, I saw Pulp in the 90s, and I thought they were amazing. But I have to say, this current iteration, I'm not one of those snobby, kind of purists that's like, oh, it was always better, back in the day or whatever. I don't think so. I think they would even agree that, like, what they're able to pull off now, just with all the tech gear and stuff and how much better it's gotten, they can recreate those records that...
I just saw Devo, and they sounded better than ever. And their visuals and their performance, I mean, they were astounding.
I think one thing, we should touch on this, because I think this comes up a lot, and I end up coming off as the grumpy old man and saying this, but I'd say the most depressing thing to me that in my view is sort of destroyed what I loved about live music growing up is that because there's no money in most of it, the only way the bands can make money is to play these huge festivals.
Yeah.
And most of these bands don't sound good outside, or they can sound good, but they have to really like change the whole dynamic of the band.
Yeah.
Whereas most of my favorite shows were at these smaller venues.
Right.
And there's something about that intimacy.
Yes. That's
incredible. And it's not about being there first or before they broke, or it's not even about that. It's just more about, like, a Dinosaur Jr. or a My Bloody Valentine is always going to sound better inside because they have Marshall stacks and they're playing guitars really loud, and that's how it's supposed to...
in front of you.
Yeah, they're supposed to sound like that. Yeah, they're supposed to sound like that, and you lose it. I mean, I remember when I first moved here, there was a festival called FYF, which was Fuck Yeah Fest, and it was eventually bought by Golden Voice, like everything else, and I think it was Beach House and My Bloody Valentine, which are two of my favorite bands. And it wasn't like they were bad. It's just that you could tell, being a fan of music, if this show was inside, it would sound 10 times better.
Yeah.
Because it's just in some field somewhere, and it just doesn't have the acoustics.
Sometimes it's raining, too.
Yeah. So, like, some of these places, I think they do the best they can for the... But the fact that that's the only thing that now exists, they have to play these bigger festivals, some of which are sort of rooted in nostalgia. But I think a lot of it, too, is just they have to pack all of these bands on one bill to be able to bring in the cattle call.
Enough people.
To do it. And then, someone told me... maybe 10 years ago, so I'd say it's even worse now, that unless you're playing like a 1,000 or 1,200 seat venue like the Fonda or the El Rey here, unless it's about that level, you're not making any money. Like, the tour is like, basically the merch is all you're getting. That's going to have to pay for gas. And this is why
a lot of times the club wants half of that, the venue. And
this is why you don't see a lot of bands coming over across the pond anymore to tour unless it's just to play these one-off festivals.
Yeah.
Like, one of my close friends is Griff Reese from this Welsh psychedelic band, Super Furry Animals.
I remember them.
Who, were really big in the 90s. In fact, they were the last, them and Oasis were the last two bands signed to Creation Records before it was sold to Sony. And they used to play in the States every album.
Yeah. And
then, it just became physically impossible to come here because there's 5 people in the band. They don't necessarily need a tour bus, but it was economically infeasible. So, Griff now kind of tours. I mean, Super Furry Animals is kind of on hiatus anyways, but he's always putting out new music. So he's kind of touring with some sort of solo band iteration, and he'll do he doesn't really do any Super Furry songs, but he'll do stuff from his other solo albums. But that's made a lot of bands, it's impossible for them to come to the States because it's impossible to make money here. Whereas it's much easier for these American bands to actually go to Europe and UK, where the distance between cities is much smaller, and they can actually go over there and make a little bit of money. I mean, a perfect example is I grew up with this band, Captain Jazz. Tim Kinsella, we actually just announced over the weekend his novel, and we're publishing that, and it's not really a music book, but Captain Jazz, like, I mean, I've known him since high school, was one of the sort of first wave emo bands.
Right.
Around the same time as like Jawbreaker. Fugazi was obviously the sort of grandfather band of that whole scene.
Oh man, I used to be in a band called Spit Pope, and we were in CMJ. We got to open up for Fugazi.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And
what a different time.
Totally different time. But like Captain Jazz they played some emo festival in Vegas last year, and they're now playing their first tour, I think in maybe 30 years.
Wow.
Now, Tim went on to form Joan of Arc after that and put out dozens of records. And then he had another band called Make Believe. I mean, he's got a band with his wife, Jenny Pulse, Kinsella and Pulse. And so he's always been playing music. But it's interesting that Captain Jazz, this band that kind of broke up before anybody knew about them, they're now about to embark on this tour. It started in Chicago over the weekend. They're going to tour for the next month. And then there's more shows like later this year. And they're playing for crowds that are far bigger than were there the first time around.
Yeah.
And it's interesting how some of this stuff is almost paradoxical. Pulp's another great example of that too. Now, Pulp was always huge in the UK in the mid-90s. They were sort of almost a tabloid band because there's that famous, I think what really put them on the map in a weird way was when Jarvis Cocker famously made fun of Michael Jackson at one of those
early canceling.
Yeah, early canceling things where, he was sort of making a mockery of sort of what Michael Jackson had become. And then that became sort of a tabloid story. Or suddenly like Jarvis was like in the tabloids not for being the singer of Pulp, but for making fun of Michael Jackson.
Right.
I mean, indirectly, I think it really helped the band because it sort of put them on the radar of a bunch of people who weren't really maybe paying attention to things, but then looked into seeing who is this guy and why is he doing this? And he was really just being satirical about the whole thing because at that point, Michael Jackson, it was pretty obvious like that he was a creep and obviously he was like musically a genius, but it was sort of he was being propped up in such a way where, and obviously this is pre-Me Too and pre-cancel culture, but it was sort of very obvious to like a lot of people involved that this was not going to end well for him. And of course he tragically died because of, I think it was fentanyl, right?
Yeah.
He's the first fentanyl death.
Yeah.
Then we obviously Prince and various others since. It's terrible.
So many great artists.
I do love the idea too of just being able to, as an adult now, make these books with working with, these people who are kind of my heroes when I was a kid.
You're kind of redefining them.
Yeah. And it's like, Orian Williams, who made the Eno documentary and also made this great documentary about Syd Barrett. And then he made his most famous film is Control, which Anton Corbijn directed.
Love that movie. All my students, I'm like, you like Joy Division, you better check this out. Even if you don't, you better check it out. And who made that? Is it Anton Corbijn?
Anton Corbijn, yeah.
Who's actually also an astounding photographer.
Absolutely. In fact, Orian, to his credit, talked Anton Corbijn. That's his first movie as director. He talked him into directing the movie.
Pretty damn good for your first movie.
And it's like, Orian is good friends with The Cure. And, after the Pulp book came out, like, me and him are now talking with The Cure. Like, apparently Robert Smith has some barn or something, wherever he lives in Sussex, wherever he grew up. He moved back there.
Yeah. I bought both of Lowell Tolhurst's books. One is his story, it's called Cured, about when he was in The Cure. He's not the drummer anymore, but all the early stuff. And then he put one out on the history of goth music.
Oh my God, I didn't realize that was the drummer. I have that book. Yeah, it's like this thick. The one that's like the history of goth. It has Robert Smith and Susie Sue on the cover.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that was the original drummer.
He and Budgie from Susie have a great podcast where they just talk about all that stuff, the history of goth and punk.
Amazing. I mean, I've always been a fan of The Cure. I was not like a super fan when I was a kid, but like the idea that we could go into Robert's archives and try to piece together some sort of
Frank
book
Zappa.
like that.
They went through so many eras. There's got to be a Cure song for everyone. I mean, Let's Go to Bed is so different from A Forest.
Yes. It's really sent me down the wormhole too, where I knew I was of age when like Disintegration and was like the great 80s record and I guess Head in the Door. I mean, I was a bit too young to have been a teenager when those records came out, but they were records that were passed down to me. But going back to the first 3 or 4 records when they really were coming out of the punk scene.
Boys Don't Cry, all that. Very different.
Yeah, like the original version of From Pornography of a Forest or something. Yeah. It's like, you know, I remember, like, because that's what was popular when I was a teenager, was like the remix version of that from the late 80s.
Yeah.
Like, I realized like how much musicianship.
Well, and I think that, and I hope that you point this out if you do a book with Robert, he's a very underrated guitar player. In fact, I hear a big influence on Dave Navarro from Jane's Addiction. I mean, Robert's an amazing guitar player, and people don't really think about that. Probably all the younger people just remember him being on South Park when he had to battle Barbra Streisand. Did you see that episode?
Oh my God, I totally forgot about that. I do remember that. It became...
She's attacking the town, and they're like, we need to call Robert Smith.
I sadly found out about this because of, you know, early internet memes, and then went back and watched the episode. And that was one
Stan is like, Disintegration is the best album of all time.
I do love how The Simpsons and South Park have made cameos.
White Stripes. Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed part 2 of The Cuts Are Nuts with my friend J.C. Gabel. By the way, while you're waiting for part 3, please go to Hat and Beard Press. Check out all the cool books that they are making. The book of the day for me would be She Is Still Here. Genesis P-Orridge, the final interview by David Charles Rodriguez. If you grew up like me listening to bands like Throbbing, Gristle, Psychic TV, you'll know that Genesis was the singer for both of those bands. Very innovative person, and this is the last interview that she ever did, so you want to check it out, and there is a really cool documentary that coincides with this book release. Hope you'll join us again for part 3 with J.C. Gabel. Thanks for listening, everybody. This is your host, Malcolm Moore, from Creativity is the Cure. Tune in next time for part 3.